Okay. So I'll start now. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 4th edition of the Jadunath Bhavan Archival Talks, hosted on Zoom and on the Facebook page of the Jadunath Bhavan Museum and Research Center. I'm Prachi Deshpande, the current convener of the JBMRC, which is a unit of the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta, and houses, among other things, sections of the library and special scholar collections and its extensive textual and visual archives. It is to showcase these archival collections and bring them to the attention of younger scholars and a wider public that we started this seminar series featuring scholars who have used these archival collections in their research. So today I am delighted to introduce Sujan Mukherjee, who will be speaking on surveying and reordering urban space, debates from the CIT archives, which are the Calcutta Improvement Trust archives. About them in a minute. Sujan submitted his doctoral dissertation titled The City as Colonial Mnemonic earlier this year at Jadavpur University, where he was a SILF fellow. He currently heads the research and development team at the Delhi Art Gallery's museum exhibition in Kolkata and continues to write on the side. Sujan's research interests include urban history, physical cultures, and modernist studies. He has been involved with a number of archives and museums over the past few years in various capacities, including the JBMRC as an IFA archival fellow, the Guru Sarai Museum, and the School of Cultural Texts and Records at Jadavpur. I'm especially happy to welcome Sujan back to the JBMRC because he was very instrumental in the collaboration that we did with the DAG and the Victoria Memorial Hall back in November, featuring Nandalal Bose's postcards. So, let me now turn it over to Professor Lakshmi Subramaniam, who I'm also very happy to welcome back here to one of the center's events. Dr. Subramaniam really needs no through this group, but she is here particularly today to speak about the CIT archives, which she was instrumental in sort of getting digitized and bringing to the center's archives. So, Lakshmi is currently visiting professor at the BITS Pilani Goa campus after she retired from the center. Welcome back, Lakshmi, and I hand it over to you now to tell the audience a little bit about the CIT collection that we have over here, and then you can turn it over to Sujan.
Okay, I'm not going to have my video on because of bandwidth issues. So I'm just going to speak, and maybe Prachi can tell me whether I'm audible or not.
You are audible. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Well, it's a delight to be back. Even if virtually for one of the talks organized by the JBMRC. I've been asked specifically to introduce the collection pertaining to the CIT. I'm not entirely sure I'm going to be able to say anything terribly new or what I've already done in the descriptive catalog that I put together sometime in 2016. But I do want to make some general points about this particular collection and about the challenges of this particular collection, both in accessing it and in using it. So I want to make the point that the digitized material we have in the CSSC is a very small part of the actual CIT archive. And therefore, all researchers, I think, have to be mindful of the logic that undergirded our arrangement and assemblage, and of the logic that undergirds the CIT's arrangement. So I think it's important for us to recognize it because this is only a part of something that we accessed. I also want to preface my comments by acknowledging the deep interest that colleagues in the CSSC showed, and especially Ritu Jyoti, who was instrumental in making access available to this particular repository. I also want to acknowledge the cooperation we got from Mr. Ashok Das of the CIT, who really was adamant in allowing the CSSC to have some access, because it sort of, I think, demonstrated to me the importance of multiple stakeholders in making an archive possible. I also want to put on record the extraordinary work done by our research assistants. I'm thinking of Ujan. I'm also thinking of Shinjini, who really literally physically braved vermin, rats, and weather to actually make available the material, scan it, and bring it over to the CSSC and help me actually write a fairly preliminary descriptive catalog. So I think, when I'm thinking about the CIT, I'm thinking about all the people who actually were responsible in making this collection available. Now, I don't need to emphasize the importance of institutions like the Calcutta Improvement Trust in writing the history of urbanism in India. We have wonderful work. I'm thinking of Shuparna Mitra, P.K. Datta for Calcutta. I'm thinking of Prashant Kedambi and Shekhar Krishnan for the Bombay story of the Improvement Trust. And I think there's no doubt that this kind of meticulous analysis of the material of the improvement trusts have been vital in understanding urbanism, and particularly in understanding the paradoxes of development and improvement mediated through the trust. I think in today's times, the whole idea of urban space being central to all kinds of narrativization, including narratives of contagion, is something that is especially relevant. And I bring this point partly because a lot of the work on improvement trusts has to do with containing epidemics and space, containing the problems of housing and labor and space, and all the challenges thereof. Now, let me just give a very, I'm just going to use a couple of minutes to just talk a little bit about the collection that we actually have and that we digitize. I'm not entirely sure of the status of the collection in terms of the CSSC's holdings, but let me say that this digital collection that we have has an archival history. It was made possible with a memorandum that we signed in 2014 with the Kolkata Improvement Trust. To the extent possible, we digitized material that followed the structure of the CIT's arrangement, with one additional input, namely of adding to the proceedings of the CIT board, which is really the core of the collection, but we added to this particular core the proceedings of departments under the CIT, especially the Land Revenue Department and the Valuation Department. So I think this was very important because we realized very early on that just looking at the proceedings of the Board of Trustees of the CIT were full of gaps, and there were too many gaps. And so we realized fairly early on, we've got the entire proceedings digitized from 1912 to 1976. But given the gaps, we realized that we had to consult other departments, the Valuation Department, which turned out to be the most comprehensive. So I think this is something which I'd like to sort of once again draw attention to, that when we look at a large archive like the CIT, how much of investigative reporting or sleuthing you needed to do to be able to join the dots between what was given in the Valuation Department, who had access to the Valuation Department files, who had access to the circulars in the reading room, who had access to the chairman's copy. So I think, in a sense, the material, the very practice of looking at the material and digitizing it, I think gave us some valuable clues as to how to approach the larger ethnography of any archive. And I therefore would like to put this on record because I think when researchers use it, it might be useful for them to participate in a kind of interactive exercise so that our understanding of the archive gets more complete. Now, the descriptive catalog that we put together for a particular seminar for our funders, the Max Weber Stiftung, who gave us some money to enable the project, is fairly tentative. And therefore, I really hope that users who continue to use the descriptive catalog, which basically tells you what the document is about it about certain disputed disputes over land acquisition? Is it about the problems of developing a particular municipal square, problems of street lighting, sanitation, the setting up of markets? But I do hope that we could use the descriptive catalog as a kind of very preliminary template, and we have users of the archive to add to this, to tell us what more we could do in adding to the catalog, and thereby making the CSSC's initial initiative a kind of seed for a larger public history of the city. I think this is something which we really need to think about. The CSSC has done so. We've had some very important exhibitions around the collection on thinking about the city. We've had very good exhibitions on looking at the city through photographs. And I'm therefore still hoping that the CSSC can, with the help of researchers as the primary stakeholder, work with other centers and sort of create a consortium to take up the initiative of not just digitizing, but also of adding to the logic of studying an archive of a particular trust to speak about the city. I'm really looking forward to what Shujan has to say, the kind of debates that he wishes to touch on, and it sort of triggers my interest in urbanism, which at the moment I'm particularly interested in, partly as a vector for understanding contamination and contagion of different kinds. The virus, not just in epidemiological terms, but also in social terms. So yeah, thanks Prachi for giving me the option. It's good to see lots of friends virtually, and I really look forward to listening to what Shujan has to say. So thanks again.
Thank you, Lakshmi. Over to you, Sujan.
Yeah. Okay. At the outset, let me thank everyone at the JBMRC for making this possible. Professors Taupadi Bhattacharyya, Prachi Deshpande, and Rosinka Chaudhary for arranging the series of talks and for inviting me to present this work here. I also thank Professor Lakshmi Subramaniam, who led the digitization project. And I did get a sense of the kind of work and the kind of thinking that went behind it, but already I feel that I need to revisit the archive to kind of factor in the nuances that she brought to the fore in this brief introduction to the CIT archives at the JBMRC. I'd also like to thank Dr. Komalika Mukherjee for helping me find my ways around the papers, and Professor Partho Dotto, who is joining us today, who deserves special mention, I mean, personally, because he's the one who introduced me to the work of Patrick Geddes, and for sharing with me the elusive and valuable Bada Bazaar report, which kind of creates a wonderful dialogue with what the CIT holdings contain. I would also like to thank Smita Khator of the School of Culture, Texts and Records at Jadavpur University, who helped me navigate the papers of the Bengal Chamber of Commerce, and Professor Bornita Bagchi, who invited me to share an early version of this research at the University of Utrecht in 2018. So this essentially is a kind of revised and somewhat truncated form of a chapter that I wrote for her book on urban utopias that came out last year. And there, what I tried to do was to kind of look at utopian thinking at this moment in the early 20th century, roughly around the time of the First World War, when the CIT has just come into existence and it's taking its first sort of stuttering steps. And the idea there was to look at utopianism in urban planning at the turn of the 20th century, in the works of the CIT, in the works of Patrick Geddes, and in a work of speculative fiction, which came out in 1914, as we'll get to that, but essentially to kind of understand these kinds of impulses that were there behind the urban planning that was taking shape in that 1 decade or so. Of course, what I am not looking to do here is to offer a general evaluation of the CIT's work. I mean, there is a considerable body of scholarship on that, and it's also quite difficult to kind of extrapolate from a few small debates that are taking place around this time to kind of reflect on the larger implications of the work that the CIT did. It's also very difficult to quantify in a certain sense. Um, so what I'll try and do here is to kind of bring to the fore the material that I found at the CIT, within the CIT papers digitized by the Center for Studies and Social Sciences, and try and look at two particular areas. One which is the method of survey, and the other being this idea of rehousing um, displaced populations within a city. So the larger chapter also focuses, also goes into history and memory in the city and the contrasting approaches of the kind of monumental imperialist historiography that was inaugurated, that was kind of epitomized by Curzon, and the Gedesian understanding of the social soul of the city, which is slightly, I know it sounds vague, but we could go into that at some later point perhaps. So I'll start with, I'll start going over this. I don't particularly have much to show in terms of visual material because there are lots of maps, but unless I actually go into the maps, it doesn't really make sense to just just to show the maps out here. Yeah. So with a population of around 8.5 lakh people at the turn of the 20th century, Calcutta seemed like an impossible problem to solve. Many dreamt of dramatic changes that would usher in a brave new age for the empire's second city. And one name in particular kept coming back. It was that of Baron Haussmann, who under Napoleon III had transformed Paris beyond recognition. In the 1907 guidebook, which is actually an imperial historiography disguising itself as a guidebook, titled titled Calcutta Old and New, H.E.A. Cotton remarked that, quote, "The talk is all of an Anglo-Indian Haussmann who is to transform the teeming Indian quarters." And a couple of decades before him, Rudyard Kipling had articulated his Victorian horror at the city of dreadful night, as he called it, in similar terms. He said, I quote, "All the more reason then to turn several Haussmanns loose in the city with instructions to make barracks for the population that cannot find room in the huts and sleeps on the open ways." In 1905, in a speech to the Bengal Chamber of Commerce, Lord Curzon had confessed, I quote, "I almost feel you may regard it as a strange ambition, as if when I laid down the post of Viceroy, I should like to become chairman of the Calcutta Corporation." He had warned, however, that as chairman, he would, quote, "exact rather large conditions, including 10 years of office, sufficient cash, and a free hand." Essentially, again, a generous offer to turn himself into a Haussmann, with the focus of these reformative programs remaining firmly on the Indian quarters. Now, despite the criticism that the Bombay City Improvement Trust, which Lakshmidi mentioned at the outset, and there's wonderful work on it by Prashant Kidambi, um, despite the criticism that it faced, many pinned their hopes on an urban revival on the CIT. Instituted by an act in 1911, it was not a representative body, and as such was seen as wielding more executive power than the apparently inefficient municipal corporation that was weighed down, at least in principle, by democratic ideas, even after sweeping changes were brought about by the Act of 1899. Among those who thought it prudent to manage expectations was Everard Digby, a journalist about whose work we'll get into later, who echoed the public anticipation of, at best, a few more wide roads patterned on the roads they already knew and the clearance of insanitary areas. And among those who offered nuanced critiques of the CIT's overall approach was Patrick Geddes, Scottish biologist and urban thinker, who had been invited as a consultant by Lord Pentland, the governor of Madras, to display his cities and town planning exhibition that had attracted attention in England, Ireland, and Scotland. Unfortunately, a part of this exhibition sunk with the ship the Emden, because there was, some naval battles that were being fought on the Arabian Sea. And Patrick Geddes, he becomes this kind of a very, he's a very interesting figure in general. Those who are familiar with the urban, with the history of urban planning around the time will be familiar with his work. And he had a very interesting sort of network within India when he came here. And what makes it particularly interesting is that he comes out as this kind of provocation to the CIT almost. I mean, his work, unfortunately, I mean, his criticism of the CIT isn't taken very seriously by the members of the CIT. In fact, they're quite snide about it. We'll get to that in a bit. But what Geddes does, in fact, is something that I would not have. I mean, it's difficult to know the kind of impact that his work has without kind of looking at the other side of the argument, which is found in the CIT's minutes, where they are kind of, I mean, being dismissive, but at the same time, someone who's very difficult to ignore. And that adds layers of nuance to this debate that would simply otherwise not have existed. And I mean, it's unfair to say that his work didn't have tangible results. It did, but perhaps not in the ways that Geddes expected it. So looking primarily at the CIT papers digitized and housed at the JBMRC archives, my presentation today is an attempt to understand how these different ideological positions played out not only in the discourse around urban planning, but even through the seemingly banal practicalities by focusing on two aspects of the debate, like I said, on the strategies of conducting city surveys and on urban reordering and its impact upon housing, particularly for workers. As a speculative extension of the CIT Geddes debate, I'll also consider Digby's brief work of speculative fiction titled Calcutta 50 Years Hence, that came out in a magazine in support of Britain's First World War efforts titled Indian Ink. Now, this is a text that, for some reason, has not been regarded very seriously in this kind of, in either the speculative literature of on and off the city, but even in this kind of thinking of urban planning, because it's really kind of fascinating peek into what the popular sentiments were about this. It's very much along the lines of, say, something like Jules Verne's Paris in the 20th century, which was written in the wake of the Haussmannization of Paris. And Digby's text essentially pushes certain ideas that were prevalent at the time to their logical and sometimes illogical extremes, thereby offering a detached vantage point from which to consider the ongoing debates on the ground. So the first section that I'll be looking at is the city walker and the surveyor. So this is where, I mean, we start with this kind of quote, this kind of thinking that we find in Michel de Certeau, which becomes one of the most frequently quoted sections about this apparent dichotomy between the city walker and the city surveyor. So in the practice of everyday life, Certeau draws a distinction between the ordinary practitioners of the city who operate below the thresholds at which visibility begins. And on the other hand, he talks about the city surveyors, cartographers, and planners who reduce the complex text to, I quote, a theoretical, that is a visual simulacrum, making themselves alien to the experiences of everyday life. So a similar distinction between the streetwalker and the urban surveyor, the urban planner by extension, is rehearsed, as David Frisby points out, by other Marxist urban writers as well, such as Henri Lefebvre. And although there are exciting ideological implications of this oppositional dichotomous reading, it has been called into question in recent scholarship for its lack of specificity in understanding the process through which these surveys were actually conducted. And this is not to dilute the argument about the problematic nature of this top-down method of urban surveys, but to, in a sense, demystify the alternative methods as well. So something that's opposed to the top-down method is not necessarily the perfect alternative. It's not necessarily the most democratic, the most open-ended sort of alternative. And there is a potential there for gathering insidiously a great deal of ethnographic data as well. So we will return to this point again as we look at the different strategies for surveying. What the CIT papers offers is a rare glimpse into the nitty-gritties of the process. And it really kind of drove home to me the point that even while there was this kind of utopian, almost, this kind of optimism that we find in the CIT's planning, they were also very, very conscious of the fact that it was difficult to achieve. So by the 20th century, it had been established that any meaningful city survey contained an accurate topographical mapping of the space with added layers of information that could be sociological, ethnographic, infrastructural, and so on. The method of mapping, which relied on the age-old technique of triangulation, was in use in Europe first before it was perfected in India in the most challenging circumstances to measure mountain ranges. In fact, the standard device used by the Ordnance Survey in Indian cities was the 7-inch Everest's vernier theodolite designed by George Everest during his days at the Trigonometric Survey of India. The process involved setting up stations, so points on top of buildings and other high and conspicuous places at gaps of about a quarter of a mile, about 3/4 of a mile, and down stations, which would be about 1,200 to 1,800 meters apart. So what I found very interesting is that, again, Lakshmidi mentioned that the rationale for the CIT's archive, I mean, the larger archive that exists and the digitization project are different. And I mean, of course, that is true. But what I found quite fascinating about the work that JBMRC has done is that I also chanced upon a lot of the literature that the CIT members were reading. So a large part of the library is also part of the digitization project, as a result of which, for instance, this particular book, C.L. Robertson, who was the Deputy Superintendent of the Survey of India, I mean, we find works by people like him that were being used by the CIT to kind of, plan and create this body of knowledge about the city, which I mean, uh, it's difficult to kind of get a sense of that only by reading the minutes or only by reading the reports that come out. So that really kind of adds layers to our understanding of what the CIT was in fact thinking, and it turns out that it wasn't quite as Haussmannian. I mean, they were always aware that they were weighed down by these practical difficulties. So C.L. Robertson had adopted this technique for Indian cities, and he was sensitive to the response that people on the ground might have to the sense of their land being quantified in such mechanical ways. And he suggested obtaining police protection for the surveyors. Even at home in Britain, Robertson writes, they had faced hostilities from citizens, and he was apprehensive that the reaction may be even stronger in India when, he said, dealing with a population of mixed creeds and social prejudices, apparently oblivious to the colonizer-colonized dynamic in the optics of this. One of the most comprehensive surveys of the city to come out in the early 20th century was done by E.P. Richards, who claimed to have derived his information after covering a staggering 600 miles on foot over a period of 5 or 6 months. So once the topographical map was chalked out, and again, I think at every stage we see that the cartographers are aware that, I mean, even if it is the most perfect sort of cartographic representation, even that might change at a later date. Once this was achieved, then it was time to layer this with information derived from surveys like the one that E.P. Richards undertook. The CIT's library allows us to contextualize some of these ideas and methods present in the minutes, such as the work of Raymond Unwin, for instance, who is cited extensively and strategically by Richards. So Raymond Unwin was another one of those who drew heavily upon Patrick Geddes, whose works are there in the CIT archives, and Raymond Unwin really charts out a kind of manual for what he feels would be the ideal way of surveying a city. And Unwin, he turns to examples of Seabohm Roundtree's survey of York of 1899, T.R. Marr's survey of Manchester, which was taking place while he was writing his book, and Charles Booth's surveys of East London that were taking place in the late 19th century. Unwin acknowledged, Richards acknowledges these worthy predecessors whom he finds in Unwin as legitimizing his own method. So Richards, in a sense, his view is very much aligned with that of the CITs. He's undertaking this, this enormous and this very detailed survey, but at the same time, as you read through it, you get the sense that, I mean, it's not as if he's kind of engaging with the people, or there's very little. I mean, it's almost like a foregone conclusion what he's about to say, and there are some very valuable insights which we can get to at a later point, perhaps. But In fact, one of the longer passages, Richards quotes from Unwin, stops pointedly before Unwin had launched into an appreciation of Geddes's method. Unwin's admiration of Geddes, however, was not unqualified. He said, though it may not be practicable to carry the survey to the extent suggested by him, that is Geddes, there can be no doubt about the importance of the development is to grow healthily from the past life and present needs of the town. The greater part of the work must necessarily be done by the sociologist, the historian, and the local antiquary. So this is where fundamentally the Geddesian vision and the Richards approach differ. So when Richards is surveying this and is working closely with the CIT team, it's very much, I mean, coming from a point of expertise that is looking to change the city, whereas what Geddes is trying to do and what Unwin, therefore, after Geddes kind of advocates, is to look at it through the lens of, of multiple disciplines to kind of gain a more nuanced understanding of the demographic information that can be added to the cartographic layering. So like Geddes, Unwin's recommended method was participatory in nature too, in that citizens were expected to participate in compiling the research for these added layers. Now it was up to a multidisciplinary team of experts to interpret that data and based on that suggest a plan for urban reforms, rather than working backward where you already have a CIT and you need kind of a survey that that justifies the kind of plans that it is drawing up. One of the most interesting encounters here takes place when Patrick Geddes actually takes a walk with Albert Dubois Shrosby, the chief surveyor and valuer to the CIT. And this again, going back to Lakshmi's point that, there are these dialogues that are taking place between the valuation department and the surveys, and very interesting results that come out as a result of these intertextual readings in a sense. Sometime in 1916, these two men with diametrically opposed views took 3 extensive walks through Bada Bazar. I would call it a stereoscopic view of the neighborhood, except for the fact that the city they saw and the data they collected from it differed widely. In his note on the Bada Bazar improvement, so this is Shrosbury's note on the Bada Bazar improvement plans that were drawn up by the CIT. Shrosbury recalled that the only remedial suggestions Geddes had supposedly made during these walks were that, quote, individual houses should be demolished at close intervals so as to provide ventilation space for the surrounding houses, and that shrines to Hindu deities be built to prevent nuisance corners. So these two men, they take their walk and clearly exchanging notes while they are walking. And I mean, it's difficult to explain. Perhaps Geddes was a reticent walker, but essentially what Shrosbury says that, what he took away from Geddes's reflections upon these while they were on these walks was fairly, facetious and kind of not insubstantial. So while for Richards or Shrosbury, the information gathered from these walks more or less corroborated their overall predetermined design for the area, Geddes's vision was informed by an analytical lens that studied not only the circulation of traffic around the cities or the narrowness of the lanes, but also the spatial practices of the locals along with their social traditions that that interacted closely with architectural forms. Geddes's suggestions about the Bada Bazar plan, drawn up by the CIT, reflected his belief in conservative surgery, which essentially meant minimal and strategic interventions into the fabric of a city. So for Geddes, these conservative surgeries were based on a few fundamental principles that keep recurring in his work across India and elsewhere as well. The first of which was to foreground smaller units of a city, such as the neighborhood or a particular district, as opposed to looking at the city as a whole. So essentially, rather than trying to solve problems by looking at the city as a grand sort of narrative and just kind of, drawing these thick, heavy lines through the more thickly congested districts and neighborhoods, Geddes was in favor of solving them in their own terms and hoping that in the end, once you have solved these local problems, they have a larger impact on the city and how things circulate, the efficiency of movement, while maintaining certain. This is the second point, which is attention to unique local spatial practices that had been evolved due to the specific conditions prevailing in the area. So that's again part of this reading where he was insistent that you need to understand each neighborhood in its own terms, and to look at the way people use space. So two examples that he just two of many examples that he offers is that that in the Bada Bazar, often the same plot of land, which would be a shop, would be, say, used both as a residential and a commercial area, which kind of rendered the kind of surveys that Richards were undertaking a little open to critical questioning, because it wasn't as simple as just marking out plots of land, as either residential or commercial, but many of them were serving as both. And this kind of again has implications when we look at the section on urban housing for the working groups. And then there was this other famous kind of remark which has been sort of quoted often afterwards, which is where he said that what is a lane if not a footpath with no street beside it. So Geddes was in favor of kind of championing these lanes and looking at how within a small section what was the most efficient way for conveyance. And if it wasn't a speeding vehicle, that's fine. So long as they are in their own terms arranged efficiently. So, and the third was an attempt to historicize the social and spatial practices so that they can be carried forward into the future while maintaining their fundamental aspects. The fundamental aspects of the identity of the people, of the inhabitants across time, while incorporating more efficient technologies. Geddes's rejection of the heavy-handed methods of the CIT, who even considered building Calcutta's main railway station at Bada Bazar completely kind of like untying the Gordian knot, just kind of clearing it away and removing the station from Howrah to this side. And his suggestions about this conservative surgery that would allow narrower bylanes and shortcuts that would enable an easier circulation of traffic within the neighborhood. So it's a little perplexing that the CIT record kind of completely ignores the nuances of the Geddesian suggestions. Again, it could be that Shrewsbury in particular was not exposed to this, or it could be that it was just their way of kind of sidelining a fairly powerful critique of what the CIT was trying to do in Bada Bazar. Geddes's opinion was also sought on a number of different projects in Calcutta, and he even gave a series of lectures on urban planning at the town hall. He was, however, considered as somewhat of an outsider among urban planners. His popularity with the CIT suffered from around the time of the exhibition, following which suggestions by Indian members of the board to consult Geddes on various matters were rejected outright. And the CIT, who had paid to bring him from Madras to Calcutta, actually refused in the middle of this to pay whatever they were supposed to, a share of the cost of Geddes traveling to Dhaka. So, clearly he did kind of ruffle quite a few feathers within the CIT with this kind of, fairly prophetic in a sense approach towards urban planning and his critique of their approach. The chairman, C.H. Bompas, also spoke somewhat, quite unflatteringly of Geddes, summing up his stay and their engagements with the Scottish urban planner. He said, "The lectures of Professor Geddes may not have seemed to bear on practical matters, but I think he must have convinced everyone of what is a truism." So, of course, Geddes's plans lack a certain kind of immediate practicality that the CIT was concerned with, but as we shall see, what he kind of, the legacy that he left behind slowly, I think, had an impact on the way that the CIT also thought about, perhaps inadvertently, because there were other restrictions on the CIT's work as well. So I'll quickly go over to the section on displacement and rehousing. And after that, I'll leave with a few remarks in conclusion. So Partha Dotto has argued that the spectre of Haussmann haunted the CIT's joint report of 1913 that was compiled by James Madden and Shrewsbury. The authors had claimed that since, quote, since the work of remodeling Paris was undertaken by Baron Haussmann in 1853, there has been no comparable case of radical urban reorganization. There is a hint of optimism in the report, which goes on to say that private citizens and political representatives alike have shown their willingness to suspend their personal gains temporarily to help realize the CIT's vision. That said, I would like to argue that the CIT was all too aware of the limitations within which they had to operate, unlike Haussmann's project that was backed by the absolute power of Napoleon III. Despite their official mandate to demolish and rebuild at will, the CIT had to contend with public opinion at a volatile moment in Bengal's history, and even bargain with the Secretary of State, who considered Calcutta's urban rejuvenation a provincial matter rather than of general interest to the empire. This attitude was difficult for the CIT officials to swallow because at the time when Curzon's plans had matured, Calcutta was still the capital. So the attitude shifts considerably after the capital shifts to Delhi. Urban improvement schemes that aim to make the city a healthier, more pleasant place to live in often succeed in doing so. However, when the ultimate goal of such schemes is not to offer better housing to financially weaker groups, I mean, the working class, the laborers, and so on, this improvement usually comes at the cost of pushing them towards the peripheries. So this again was the question that a lot of thinkers at this time are kind of pondering, and I mean, really, it's the capitalist logic that dictates it. But what are the alternatives that we find? So one, again, as we shall see, is coming from Geddes. The other is coming from this work of speculative fiction, which completely goes in a very different direction. So post Haussmann Paris was a healthier city, but as James C. Scott pointed out, in Seeing Like a State, it was a healthier city only for those that were not expelled. The hierarchy of urban space in which the rebuilt center of Paris occupied pride of place, he wrote, presupposed the displacement of the urban poor towards the periphery. This hierarchization of space is part of the improvement schemes committed to the city's future. In the case of Calcutta, for example, the CIT's brief included future planning in the form of development of land in the interest of economic efficiency and common welfare. So as Professor Dotto points out, this was essentially a political move that was kind of disguising itself as apolitical efficiency. So for the CIT, the utopian dream would have been to have the free hand to destroy and build at will. The matter of rehousing those who were displaced was a matter of concern, but it was not one that was prioritized. At the 15th CIT board meeting, Charles Banks pointed out that the trust was created primarily to improve sanitation and that its first duty was to relieve the congestion of the center of the city. The plans for rehousing were vague at best. Accommodation for the displaced working classes could be found in the docklands, although Khidirpur and Watganj, I quote, this is from the CIT's minutes from 1912, were extremely insanitary areas and should be dealt with as such in view of the commercial interests at stake should epidemic diseases break out. So this was, I mean, one of the propositions that was just casually put out there, that they can be kind of relegated to Khidirpur and Watganj, that there could be housing for the poor there. But again, what would be done? I mean, these were already over congested areas. The one dissenting voice within the CIT was that of Babu Ramdev Chokhani, who suggested that before undertaking any street schemes, quote, the trust should acquire a number of bastis in the center of town and lay them out so that sanitary buildings could be erected on them, unquote. The chairman rejected this idea on the grounds that improving isolated areas before deciding on the street scheme might later force the CIT to destroy its own improved working class housing. So essentially, once you build these houses and then you have to kind of unclog this new cluster that has formed, you keep just doing this over and over again. But I mean, despite these objections to Ramdev Chokhani and people like, I mean, the rare exceptions like him who insisted that the displacement plan be, the rehousing plan be put first before the displacement plan were kind of sidelined. the displacement plan envisioned by the CIT, especially when it came to more gentrified areas, was not one of uprooting and reinstalling in the peripheries. And this is again an understanding that I really would, I mean, that I owe to the kind of the details of the minutes of the CIT. So when Sitanath Rai Bahadur pointed out that people displaced from Bara Bazar would not move to a newly laid out suburb in Maniktala, he was assured that this would not be the strategy the CIT followed. In a sense, the scheme did not propose the displacement of one group from a central region to the periphery. So this was not as Haussmann had done, where there was a kind of straight one-to-one, I mean, just relocating this group from the center to the periphery, but rather what one might call a ripple effect, where all inhabitants in a given radius would be displaced one step at a time. So it was, in a sense, a very sort of canny way of, of revaluing land within a city. In C.F. Payne's word, again from the minutes, the population would move away in layers. The people from Bara Bazar would not go far, but they would displace others who in turn would go further afield till the class of people who would be willing to live in Maniktala was reached. So this essentially is the plan that the CIT comes up with after there is internal opposition to this kind of straight displacement without rehousing scheme. Patrick Geddes suggested a radically different solution. He observed with disappointment that, quote, the facile dishousing of the bastis and tenements of the laboring classes, unquote, had not been followed up by any effort at rehousing despite the attention drawn to the problem during his town planning exhibition of 1915, after which, as we noted, his popularity dipped sharply in the CIT's books. Geddes argued against this plan of pushing the laboring classes to the periphery. It is only the upper and upper middle classes, he argued, quote, who have the time and the means for such journeys or even the physical energy after the day's work, and who find recreation in this change from their sedentary life, unquote. Even if they were to be considered only as our machines, Geddes writes, he believed that following the American efficiency management model would be more beneficial to commerce. He said, their houses must be near their work, though by no means necessarily ours, by which presumably he means the middle or upper middle classes, which may quite well be located at a reasonable suburban distance. So in a sense, it kind of completely subverts, for want of a more specific word, but subverts this kind of center to periphery capitalist logic that cities tend to be replanned in. But was there any conceivable alternative to pushing laborers to the peripheries? So it is instructive to look at the works of speculative or science fiction that emerge at moments of urban crises, real or anticipated. They have the unique ability to take urban innovations and push them to their extremes, thereby revealing some of the long-term implications that these decisions might have. Nathaniel Robert Walker's study of science fiction in the immediate aftermath of Paris's Haussmannization refers to Jules Verne's Paris in the 20th century, where Verne took Haussmann's project to this kind of a dystopian extreme where education has become wholly practical and subservient to a scientific state bureaucracy. And affordable housing has become dramatically reduced. In the city, there was only room for the Borough of Commerce, the Palace of Justice, the Prefecture of Police, the Cathedral, and the morgue. I mean, how depressingly it echoes our present times. Verne does not, however, dispatch the labor force to the city's peripheries, at least not laterally. So this is the alternative that Verne comes up with. So Paris in 1960, the forward temporal projection that Verne tries to paint, has built high rises, and the laboring classes are allowed to occupy the upper stories of these houses. So he says what they gained in proximity, they lost in elevation, a matter of fatigue henceforth and not of time. So again, it's very interesting to think of how the bodies of workers are imagined, and comparing Geddes, CIT, and these kinds of works of speculative fiction. Elevators or lifts were still very much a novelty, and the master of science fiction seemingly failed to anticipate its subsequent ubiquity. In his Bara Bazar report, Patrick Geddes does mention the use of elevators in cities in the USA which serve skyscrapers, although he appears unsure of the future of buildings of great height. So in Bara Bazar, there were 4-story tenements, and on Harrison Road, a few that went up to 5 or 6 stories, he noted in his Bara Bazar report. In Edinburgh, there were existing buildings of up to 9 or 10 stories high. Geddes confesses to have built a couple that were five stories or more in his own time. He himself occupied a flat on the 5th level, but it was pointed out to him by a professor and consultant in gynecology that in his architectural designs, Geddes thought like a man. And this is what Geddes himself writes, reporting this professor and consultant. He had urged Geddes to think of himself. Again, this is predictable casual sexism coming up. So yeah, with only a woman's strength. So Geddes needed to plan with only a woman's strength, with your food basket on one arm, your baby on the other, and another growing within. So while all these utopian plans are being drawing up, gender roles clearly remain static. Unlike Paris in the 20th century, Everard Digby's Calcutta 50 years hence, funnily both end up being set in the 1960s, is not an overtly critical take on the improvement plans waiting to transform Calcutta. Digby cites H.G. Wells as his inspiration and claims that speculative fiction has a geographical bias in the global north. The course of Calcutta's future has changed dramatically in his imagination 50 years from 1914 because of a serendipitous technological discovery rather than an ideologically informed plan. Owing to an additional zero that had crept into the calculations of one Trigantle, this is from Calcutta 50 years hence, his subsequent meeting with a scientist uh, ended up in a plan that this industrialist and the scientist come up with together to build higher and higher until Calcutta seems to lift itself off the ground. So roads vanished altogether. There is a constant flash of air trains, a succession of aeroplanes gripping the traveling wires. Over them and under them is the traffic of faster, free aeroplanes. This would have appealed greatly to the urban imagination of Le Corbusier, who kind of at one point wanted to do away with streets altogether in a sense of casual, unless they were kind of geared towards efficiency. A law had been passed in Digby's Calcutta to the effect that all suburban buildings must be constructed on compacted mud up to 10 feet high and good class settlements on 20. Thus, from the topmost flat, sentimental couples newly married would gaze northward and imagine that they could glimpse the Himalayas. In 1914, the narrator notes, there were a score of lifts in the city and the extreme height of the building was 6 stories. Now, once this new material is discovered, they start building higher, and again, it does not involve, Digby kind of comes up with his own utopian solution to rehousing the laboring classes, which does not involve any lateral peripheral relocation or indeed an altitudinal peripheral relocation. So this is how his city is kind of divided. On the ground level, except where powerhouses, factories, and the houses of superintending engineers run up a couple of 100 feet, there are the well-modeled dwellings of the cheaper labor of the city. To them, this is not a gloomy underworld. It is cool and shady. Work in the lower town is eagerly sought for by laborers from all over India and in the neighboring countries. So this kind of silver bullet solution in Everard Digby's imagination solves this problem of relocating the laboring classes to the peripheries of the city, either laterally or altitudinally. Technological innovation disrupts the binaries between the city's center and the peripheries. It remains unclear, however, if there is any scope of physical, personal, or professional mobility between these two classes of society in Digby's vision. It's also interesting that it kind of moves away from the general tone that we find in a lot of writing about these cities at the time, where 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 there was this sense. This is from Lord Sandhurst talking about the plan for about the Bombay's plan, where he said that it's important to let the sun into the lives of the working classes. So moving away from that kind of parents patrie sort of attitude, where then where there's almost this kind of moral angle to letting the sun into the lives of these people. What Digby is offering here is a kind of cool and shaded, almost not really subterranean, but lower altitude level where they could ply their trades. So, there is, of course, this broader debate between this kind of the Robert Moses plan of New York, which would kind of have these grand buildings, grand roads and arteries that would completely displace the kind of organic social growth that the streets facilitated, and on the other hand, Jane Jacobs's defense of neighborhood streets and local democratic engagement. I mean, theorists like David Pindar, for instance, insist that the grand vision of Moses is required to kind of bring cities into these new eras of efficiency, as long as they are tethered by the humane lessons that Jacobs taught. Now, this is kind of, I mean, tacitly, this argument is there between the CIT and Geddes also, but obviously it's not articulated in exactly these terms. And Geddes was very much aware of the political implications of the Haussmann model. I mean, he had seen cities such as Paris, Berlin, Petrograd, Dublin, and Chicago, which had witnessed labor unrest as a result of urban improvement projects of the older demolition type, he says. Geddes writes that, I quote, "One of the most experienced and eminent mayors of Paris, himself once a man of action and a historian of distinction, explained clearly to me in conversation, as well as by his writings, how deep and thorough was the influence of the city improvement of Paris by Napoleon III towards the causation of the subsequent troubles in Paris in 1870 to 71. He called it an artificial exaggeration of house famine." So this is Geddes's phrase where he says that, because you're kind of increasing the value of land, it's becoming more and more difficult to dishouse the numbers to rehouse the numbers you're actually displacing. And it's interesting because, I mean, these problems were practically being played out in Bombay, but for some reason, the critique took a long time to travel to Calcutta. I mean, it's quite inexplicable why the same thing, which was clearly which the Bombay Improvement Trust was struggling with, were still being implemented here. As Parthodotto argues, the presence of industries in and around Calcutta at the turn of the 20th century does not necessarily imply that it was an industrial society. Following Atiya Kidwai, he sees Calcutta as a late pre-industrial city, one that had urbanized but not yet been industrialized. This follows Anthony King's elaboration on the idea of dependent urbanization, which saw metropolitan centers in the colonizing countries urbanize alongside industrial growths, while those in the colonies urbanized without being industrialized as effectively. Under these circumstances, and with the support of the business classes, the CIT was able to implement in the following decades some of its schemes that cleared up, that's the rhetoric that we keep coming back to, cleared up congested areas in the city. The CIT's work was characterized by the three features of high modernism that James Scott identified, although how far its convictions lay in scientific or technical knowledge that came out of the Industrial Revolution is debatable. The only drawback for the CIT was the relative lack of financial power. Although opposed to the CIT's methods, Geddes's modernism had its own set of problems. Noah Heisler Rubin contests Geddes's identification as a planner without politics. This is obviously very problematic to claim this kind of apolitical position, and argues that his work cannot ultimately be read out of the imperial context within which he functioned as a part of a complex network of imperial connections, I quote, determined by a multiplicity of local realities. For Heisler Rubin, Geddes's understanding of history does not stand up to scrutiny, either as she says, seems to be that of a well-educated visitor pointing mainly to widely acknowledged highlights of the local cultures and resulting in a superficial and rather homogeneous reading. This again is debatable because it's not part of my agenda to defend Geddes, but to perhaps highlight the value of his method rather than what he actually got out of it. So we can get into a discussion about this later, because this has been even a few weeks back as part of this. I was hearing this wonderful discussion taking place where where Professor Dotto was also involved. So Scott acknowledges, however, that it would have been very hard. It would have been hard not to have been a modernist of some stripe at the end of the 19th century in the West, and Geddes was no different. Given the imperial context within which he functioned, not only in India but also in Israel, it is reductive to read Geddes only as a champion of the people's rights to the city in opposition to municipal authority, or state authority as in this case. His suggestions were often backed by state powers, and his influence on town planning and civics is recognized today. in the context of Calcutta in the 1910s, he offers a welcome alternative to the CIT's vision, which would demolish and impose designs with little regard for the city's sense of social continuity. His readings can be occasionally uninformed, but the tools and methods he brought to his own practice, when employed with a deeper understanding of existing spatial practices, perhaps by local participation, constitute a valuable critique to the Haussmannian way of thinking about cities. And Geddes' Utopia, and this is very interesting because Geddes very consciously, I think, uses the spelling EUTOPIA as opposed to Thomas More's famous pun on utopia spelt with EU, which would mean the good place, and the utopos, or the no place. So Geddes is very conscious that he insists that the city can be holds utopic possibilities if they can be realized one by one, neighborhood by neighborhood, rather than through these grand internationalist ideas of building from scratch and destroying what stood in the way. So Geddes' utopia is processual and constantly negotiating with the practical realities of urban planning, and perhaps it can also expand its own understanding of what constitutes the local and how to effectively read such histories. So I think I'll stop now, and because I've covered a considerable span and gone into the details only on a couple of occasions, because it felt like, we can get into that in questions and answers. But essentially what I'm trying to kind of get at through this is that, while it is undoubtedly an ideological opposition that we find between the CIT and Patrick Geddes, there are all these nuances that kind of, that almost, they kind of mutually influence each other in certain ways. The plans of the CIT that we see coming through inadvertently, because again, for lack of funding, has to kind of, ends up doing similar things at a much more conservative, at a much more sort of staid kind of pace. But what the CIT archives kind of add to this discussion is this, this sense that these details that kind of bring out how much there was, how much of a dialogue there was, and where these kind of disagreements stem from. So I'll stop now, and perhaps we can address some more of these issues in the question and answer, as well as I'm looking forward to hearing everyone's thoughts on this, because the article that I was referring back to came out last year, and I have been studying Geddes and going back to the CIT documents since, and it would be wonderful to kind of see where this argument can lead me as well. So I would be very grateful for your thoughts on that. So thank you.
Thank you, Sujan, for a wonderful, thoughtful paper. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. Please unmute yourself and ask a question, or you can put it down in the chat saying that you have a question, and I can call on you to unmute yourself and ask. You can also type the question into the chat box if you prefer, and I can read it out to Sujan. So the floor is open now for questions. These online formats, it takes a couple of minutes.
Wondering whether Lakshmi would like to set it off. I don't know if she's still on though. If she is,
I'm on. I'm just waiting for others to ask questions. I had one question that has
why don't you start it off?
Yeah, I had just one question that's nagged me all the time. which is the whole politics of numbering in colonial cities.
Mhm.
Do you find anything in the CIT about numbering streets, what numbering would have meant for important business people, business addresses, and also on categorization of kacha houses and pakka houses? Because if we're thinking of evaluation, if you're looking at land, if you're looking at land acquisition and in the development of a city, surely these would have been kind of issues that came up. And if I remember right, I think there's been work which says that there was actually no numbering in cities like Bombay and Calcutta. Since I don't work on it, I've always been curious about this. And I'm just thinking whether the material that you have seen so carefully and closely offers you any insights, any leads. And
Yeah.
if not, why? Because the whole idea of numbering a city or of using a grid pattern or of surveying a city is about
Yeah,
better
absolutely,
regulation. I
absolutely.
mean, I think the Calcutta Improvement Trust had all these things, had all these intentions of colonial governance. It was not just about ameliorating conditions for the poor,
Absolutely,
which I don't
absolutely.
think
Yeah,
they
yeah,
were interested in.
yeah, yeah.
So I was just thinking whether you could say something a little bit about the opacity of governance. What is the gap between what they intended and what happened? And
Yeah.
why was this so? And just some ideas,
Sure,
just some
sure, sure.
thoughts.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'll just go over this. So, to answer the first part of your question, I mean, not to answer, but to kind of add to your questions in a certain sense, uh, off the top of my head, I can't recall um, reading any specific strategizing of the numbering of these streets, but I do agree with you because, I mean, when the CIT was also kind of, ordering spaces in the southern parts of the city as well, renaming the streets and so on. I mean, if we are looking at this kind of, the flow of, I mean, almost a kind of narrative that can be built through these kinds of numberings in terms of where where a particular road begins and what is the direction that it takes. I can't, off the top of my head, recall any specific work on this. Maybe Shumantra Banerjee's book will have mentioned it, but I also don't remember seeing anything on the numbering there. So that's certainly an interesting question to think about, and I will look at it. I mean, I'm guessing that it would be something that's probably some decided at very specific points. I mean, it might
Right.
not have been uh, in these early stages also.
Right.
So
Right.
that's something that is worth thinking about.
Yeah.
And I'll
Sure.
definitely
Sure.
sort of go back to that. The other
Sure.
thing I, in fact, intended to mention this at one point, which is the gap that you mentioned between what the CIT sets out to do and what it actually ends up achieving. Is this kind of we found somewhat hilarious is E.P. Richards in his report when he kind of he does his surveys and then he comes up with these plans and schemes to solve these issues. So I mean, they are very, very aware of the fact that they simply don't have the funds to do everything that they want to do, and so a particular plan is divided. The subsections that we find in this plan are the moderate ideal for Calcutta, the sub-ideal for Calcutta, the sub-ideal cut down, and the sub-ideal cut down and reconsidered.
Right.
So that's the level of, I mean, they need to kind of factor in that so many things may not fall into place. And in the early days, of course, Calcutta, I mean, the CIT, of course, faces a great deal of opposition, even from the Amrita Bazar Patrika. And generally, there is a kind of opinion against what it is trying to do in the Bengali upper middle class kind of public sphere that we see. And that's very strongly present at this time. And it's, I mean, of course, they do kind of get around to implementing a lot of these plans, particularly in South Calcutta. We see, I mean, the impact of this very strongly even now. And even then, when they're doing this. People like Mukul, they are coming up with these, and Professor Dotto also mentions this in his book, that they're coming up with these kind of very powerful nostalgic images of Calcutta that keep coming up when the CIT is first kind of opening its plans up to discussions.
Right.
There's also this entire thing where the CIT had these general schemes so there were two ways that they were operating. One was where they would invite local populations of a particular area, if they numbered more than 25, could appeal to the CIT to intervene in some developmental activity. And
Right.
on the other hand, there were the street schemes. So these were the two areas in which they operated. This also is there in Professor Dotto's book,
Right.
Planning the City. And again, as he points out, I mean, people were afraid of incurring the wrath of nationalist leaders by turning to the CIT for this kind of a thing, because essentially what the CIT was also doing was to kind of undermine the representational
Exactly.
representational nature
Yeah.
of the municipal corporations board.
Exactly.
So that way, I mean, it's kind of a deferral, really. I mean, they do get around to
Yeah.
implementing a lot of these plans. Some projects like the Bada Bazaar report, I mean, don't take off at all, because I mean, it's just simply the outlay is much too big for them to undertake
Right.
at this point.
Right. Yeah, but I think, sorry, I'll stop now.
Sure,
But I
no.
think in developing that argument, which you quite persuasively put forward, I think you can make an intervention about this whole thesis on colonial urbanism. To what extent is it dialogic, and is there a temporal framework to it? Because if you look at developments of the 19th century, if you look at work that's been done by Preeti Chopra for Bombay, for instance, you realize how much of investment in experiencing urbanism by local people mattered. Clearly, there is a time frame here. And from the early 20th century, we are moving into a very different set of imperial policies and preoccupations.
Absolutely.
So I think that's I think you could actually then, stick your neck out and make an important point about the whole theme of colonial urbanism. Thank you. I really enjoyed that,
very
Shujan.
interesting
Yeah.
point. Thank
Thank
you
you very
so
much.
for
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Okay, we have questions from Manobidi Majumdar, and then Professor Partha Dotto, and then Topatidi. So Manobidi, you're up next. You can unmute yourself. And yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Shujan. Thank you very much for your fascinating talk. As an outsider, I have a small observation and a question. And this observation is about using the term citizen. In the imperial context, I think strictly speaking, they were denizens or city dwellers and not citizens. But this is a small observation. And the second one is about about Patrick Geddes. You talked very interestingly about his idea of doing only a conservative surgery. As far as physical architectural intervention is concerned. But at the ideational level, I think he was doing a radical surgery to mainstream thinking, right? Imagining, the social soul of the city and all that. So it was very radical in that sense, I think. Absolutely. And in that context, when we are talking about imagining the neighborhoods for working class people, in terms of civic amenities and sanitation facilities, wasn't it some kind of radical physical intervention also needed? So in that sense, I think wasn't Geddes proposing some kind of radical surgery?
Thank you, Manavidi. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, point taken about the nomenclature. I mean, of using citizen in this context. Where I'm using it in terms of Geddes. Geddes is, of course, talking about this kind of a slightly more, I mean, transnational in a sense, or idea of the citizen in a slightly geographically unmoored sense. But you're absolutely right about about being cautious about that phrase while referring to people who are stakeholders of a city, let's say, as a more general sort of phrasing. The other point that you make is, yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And yeah, I mean, in fact, a few weeks back, I was listening to Professor Partha Dotto, and after his talk, you're kind of going into this whole idea of Geddes' what you mentioned, which is the social soul that he talks about. And it's really quite remarkable. And I mean, in terms of the ideological or conceptual intervention that he makes, it is very, very radical. At the same time, what people like Smriti Srinivasan and Nora Eisler Rubin, they point out is that Geddes' own reading sometimes, I mean, could be kind of a little, I mean, I don't really know. I mean, I feel that what they say has some merit to it in terms of considering that Geddes' idea, which also was, in a sense, was not organically growing out of what he saw in India, so to speak. I mean, it was something that he too had developed in, I mean, that thought that he had developed elsewhere. And as such, I think there are some cases where he makes some problematic assumptions about caste in particular, and gender, as we have seen. But at the same time, what I feel is that uh, again, it's not really ours to either defend or champion Geddes. I mean, that's hardly the point of taking this discussion forward, but to kind of think of the potential that his methodology offers. And in that sense, if that is something that's adapted by people who, I mean, who are kind of maybe working along those lines, but kind of growing, I mean, thinking that through their communities and thinking that through intersectional identities and so on, it has a great deal of potential. And in addition to that, what you mentioned about this idea of the social soul, I mean, it's not just radical um, in terms of the impact it has on the city, but it's also, I think, and this is part of my doctoral dissertation, is that his the way he wants to kind of reimagine what it means to have or look at a city's past, moving away from that kind of monumentalist idea, this kind of the kind of historiography that people who form part of that Curzon nexus. I mean, I'm not saying they're all kind of working towards a common goal, but the discourse is very much geared towards something like that, which is essentially an imperialist historiography of the city. And what Geddes then comes up with is something that he kind of dismisses these kind of periodizations when he's saying that that's a different sort of history that you're looking at, the history that you find in historians' books and all. He says, and what I'm thinking of, he writes in this lecture to the Utopian Society in Chelsea, uh, is this kind of continuity of the social soul, where practices that are born out of living conditions, economic situations, etc., in a particular place kind of get transmitted from one generation to the next. And of course, these are not to be, I mean, these cannot afford to be stagnant, but kind of evolve the best parts of it and keep adding new elements so that it doesn't, so that it kind of evolves in a productive way. So definitely, I would certainly agree that it is very radical in terms of what he sets out to do.
Okay. Professor Doctor, Sapatha Doctor.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I just unmute. Thanks. So thanks, Sujan. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk, and I really learned a lot from it. And one thing I think which you did very well was to tell me something that I hadn't really thought about very much, because this whole intervention in Kolkata by the Calcutta Improvement Trust did trigger off the urban imagination in some ways, both among colonial bureaucrats and thinkers and so on, but also among the Bengali elite and other people. I think that really needs to be investigated. I just have a couple of, first of all, I just want to thank CSSS for just preserving this wonderful archive. I remember when I worked in Poddar Court, I used to go up the stairs to the first floor, and there was a mezzanine floor which said CIT archives. I just didn't have the courage to enter it because it just seemed completely. And I went up to the board office and where I looked at the CIT reports. So a couple of things I just like to ask you, since you've seen the archive in Jadunath Bhavan. So I just wanted to know. One is that one of the things that this archive is likely to do, because as I said this, I have used the CIT report, but that's only skimming the surface. But if you actually look at the, I think, I haven't seen them, but you have. If you actually look at the other reports, then you could possibly be able to reconstruct the history of Calcutta neighborhoods, because all the tension and the court cases and the intervention and the demolition and the rebuilding, and so that record must be there. If that is there, it is absolutely, it would be fabulous material. And one person who has used some of it with great insight is this new book, which lots of many people would have read it, with Navaparno Ghosh's book on Kolkata, which she actually uses some of the CIT reports, the second level reports, uses it to great strength, I think, in a book. The other thing I wanted to, I'm asking you.
Could you repeat the name of that book you just mentioned?
Navaparno Ghosh, a Hygienic City. Kolkata, I think it's called Kolkata, a Hygienic City. It's just published a year ago by Cambridge University Press. So basically, she argues that the intervention of the CIT was qualified and resisted by the Bengali Bhadralok by using the idiom of some kind of Hindu identity. And they actually managed to stall a lot of CIT work and qualify it. It's actually fascinating. She actually shows how they developed this notion of Hindu hygiene, and it's a really amazing one. She actually looks at the second level of archival material, which I hadn't seen. So I hadn't even thought about looking at it. But I would like to just draw your attention, and Shujan, you know this very well, but to everybody else, but two other things. One is in the boardroom in Poddar Court, there used to be a couple of wooden almirahs where, as you rightly said, you have already drawn, there were these books, and reports kept, and somebody in the 60s or the 70s had carefully put accession numbers to them. And I hope that be saved, because that was a wonderful collection of books published on the city in the 20s, 30s, and also all the CIT published reports. I see all of them, but they're there. So that would be really worth saving. And somebody had carefully did that. Maybe Bompas had done it. I don't know who had done it. That's one thing. The second thing, and this is very interesting, is something about what you talked about, the dialogic thing between the CIT and people who did not necessarily agree with them. You would be surprised to know that although they rejected Geddes, but a complete set of Patrick Geddes's reports from all over India used to be kept very carefully in this CIT library, and planners from all over the world till the 1940s would come into the CIT library to just consult those reports. I don't know what happened to those reports. I certainly have, the Indore report is certainly there, I know, but probably disappeared, or maybe it's been recatalogued somewhere else. So those are worth looking at again. Thirdly, and this is something, it is such a valuable source, which is that and this is something I couldn't use, because remember, I was working in the 90s, the only thing you had was Xeroxing, and very bad Xeroxing, mind you. CIT reports have photographs. It is such a, I can't tell you, and it just gives you a view of the city as it was and as it changed. I mean, take Park Circus, Park Street, anything. I mean, it is so surprising that nobody has used this. Occasionally, of all the places, Anandabazar Potrika, which I think their library has a set of the CIT reports, or they have some. They occasionally publish something in their book pages, I've noticed. So that would really be worth looking at. And lastly, extending this. So what I'm trying to say is that if we looked at the visual record of the city, then it would give us a different history of the CIT. That's what I mean. I mean, otherwise one gets overwhelmed by the logic of CIT's work. One can critique it, but one still follows that the logic of what was happening in Kolkata. But the visual record tells us something completely different. And I got an inkling of this. And again, you mentioned it. If you look at, again, I wanted to do this and I never pursued it. But right up till the 60s, Bengali artists, I say Bengali artists, but maybe not all Bengali, but were sketching and drawing Kolkata. So Mukul De, Muralidhar Tali, Horen Das, these are prints that I found in Delhi in the National, in the National Gallery of Modern Art. So, so the riches which exist in Kolkata, I'm sure they are there, and that gives you a completely different picture of Kolkata. I'll just stop here. Thank you for your wonderful talk.
Thank you so much, Parthoda. And I got, I mean, you were the one who shared a photocopy of the photocopy that you had of the Geddes one. So, yeah, I know what you mean by the.
I gave a copy to Tapotidi to put it in the CSSS library. I think it must be there, a Xerox copy. I remember also, yeah.
What you're saying about the photographs, I haven't really, I've seen them, but I haven't really thought of, looking at the kind of parallel alternative narrative that they can suggest. And Navaparna Ghosh's work, I mean, I did kind of peruse her dissertation, which was Being Urban, which I think was the, which has some of the, the germs of the book, seeds of the book that she has written now. But I also found some of that in your own research as well, which is to say that the kind of resistance that it faced from the upper caste, mostly upper caste and fairly well-to-do Bengali Hindu public sphere here as well. And that is again one of those things where I feel that, I mean, Geddes also sort of opens himself up to that critique in a certain way, because it's, I mean, he may not be coming from that same space or that same kind of conservatism at all. I mean, his is coming from a very different angle, but there are these, I mean, almost unfair intersections in what they seem to be saying at the same time. But again, as we discussed, I mean, Geddes is of course coming from a very different place. The libraries, yes, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the, I mean, most invaluable sort of things that I came across in this, the digitized archives. And they kind of, I mean, there are all these, what I also really find fascinating about that particular set is that, there is so much that was unrealized about the city. And that narrative, again, like what the cities that could have been in a certain sense. And that again is something that really comes out when you're looking at the minutiae of the CIT archives and these books that they are looking at. And couldn't agree more with you about the fact that this library was kind of, I mean, they had their own agenda. They knew what they wanted to pursue and how they wanted to pursue it. But I mean, one of those documents at the CIT archives, I remember, was about the policy of acquiring these books about and memberships that they would make with international organizations like the Garden City movement and things like that, where they would kind of facilitate urban planners in Calcutta to become part of these larger international movements as well. And of course, there is that resistance to Geddes, but there is also, I think, a great recognition of the value that his work has. And I mean, of course, in Calcutta, they didn't, they were at loggerheads, but I'm sure even the CIT considered his Indore plan or his, or the work that he did in Madras as valuable. So in terms of the neighborhoods, I mean, there are very specific sort of references in the papers as well, which talk about different. Again, it comes out through that kind of building, rehousing, that sort of a narrative. But reading against the grain, you can find the narratives of the neighborhoods themselves as well. There is a recent doctoral dissertation that has come out of Paris Sorbonne, I think, Marianne Hillon, who has been working on neighborhoods as a unit of understanding the city. I mean, she's looking at it primarily from a literary anthropological point of view. And she does kind of go into that in the, but that's more post-independence. So there's some work on that, but yeah, I mean, that would be a very, very interesting history to try and attempt, and maybe yeah, it's a challenge worth taking on at some point to kind of see what comes out of that. So thank you so much for that, and for the discussions that have shaped this work.
Shall we go to Tapati Di? If there are other questions, just please mention them in the chat, and I'll call on you after that. Tapati Di, go ahead.
Thank you, Shujan, for a very, very interesting presentation. I'd like to just begin with some of the reflections, which is not part of my question to you, but some things that Partho brought up just now, which is that it was a matter of great regret that we could not document the photographs side by side with the proceedings. And both Lakshmi and Shinjini, who was then working, will know that this is something, because I know the photographs remarkably open up a whole new dimension to it. So when we mounted a small exhibition as part of the City in the Archive, we put up just 6 panels on different projects. And at that time, I think from the website, we were able to take a few photographs, like on the Thakuria Lakes, on two of them. But I know that we're dealing here with another real minefield of material there. And had we had the funds to continue, etc., we may have been able to move on to photographs. And, as Partho said, as individual researchers working in a period when all these facilities are not available, much of this could have been done professionally. Having said it, I think it's also important to mark the timeliness of the intervention that the Center's digitization project did, because I know from future researchers, Krishti, who may be here, Shukanna, Mitro, that actually Poddar Court has bundled up all the material to a Soltec office, where they're still lying bundled up. And given that even the lack of order in the CIT archives was nonetheless something that people carried in their heads, right? Somewhere, some order. Once they move to the new venue, they become truly inaccessible because nobody's even opened up these bundles and they're waiting. And I know that people have to go, people are offering to themselves process some of the material, but when it will ever happen, nobody knows. So I think that whatever little we did do was very timely, because that Poddar Court venue itself is now emptied of its archive. So I just wanted to put that out there. I wanted to take up the question of neighborhoods and the organicity of a city vis-a-vis the vision of planners. So there are clearly 2 parallel histories that are running through any work on urbanism, which is a kind of history of planning, different visions and ideologies, different methods, a way to relocation, to planning. So, and I think the material you presented between the CIT and the debates or with Geddes really is about that history of planning, where Geddes, as you said, becomes an example in a history of planning. So whether or not they're implemented, his material becomes there, which any history of planning would return to. But then there is also the question of what would actually constitute what he says the social soul of the city. What are the stakeholders with which he's in dialogue? Because, he's walking through Bara Bazaar, surveying, trying to, because it is that debate, say a certain Hindu elite is able to leverage certain position for themselves, right? I'm thinking of the temple in the middle of the Shobha Bazar area, which nobody can touch. So you have to build a road around it. And there are many others such. That's an obvious leverage. So I'm thinking here of, were there other stakeholders, particularly among the working and trading classes, say in the Bara Bazaar, who are brought into active consensual decisions? And I think even with Geddes, it is an imagined sense of what will be a socially much more sensitive approach to preserving an area, its neighborhood, while opening it up. But I'm thinking about whether there are conversations on the ground with stakeholders, with dwellers. I'm thinking about the relocation to Maniktala and how that would, whether that kind of material is at all there to allow us to think of an interface then between what we may think of as a living neighborhood, residents, stakeholders, and then even a socially sensitive ideology of planning. And I ask this with a particular context of a more recent, almost failed exercise, which was with Kumurtuli. And over years, that place has meant to be developed. And a process finally began where half of them were relocated to a nearby way because they refused to leave the riverfront. And the rest remain. So it's this project that began under the CPM that Mamata promised would take forward. Then many people resisted, and now it's just hanging there with the whole settlement turning into two slums rather than one, right? So there's one there. So, and it was a classic instance of a planning initiative that the Kumartuli idol makers all wanted, but nothing was quite really done, and the unions took over. So I'm thinking back to Bara Bazar and wondering whether what would be that interface that even a Geddes who's looking at a much more socially sensitive one would bring up. And then on the point of neighborhoods, what's quite ironical, but what's also important to note is that in the north, all the roads that are being made involve destruction of older neighborhoods, congested older neighborhoods. But at the same time, as we know, CIT opens up a series of new neighborhoods in South Kolkata. So that sense, CIT is directly involved in the making of South Kolkata, right? In parks and the lakes and all the neighborhoods that grow. So again, it would be interesting, and there are middle class stakeholders who greatly benefit from those interventions of opening up the South. So that's really what I wanted to think, that what does socially organic city planning, what would it be? And a final point only to think about. I was really intrigued how your novel takes us into Calcutta of the 1960s, imagines. To think about Calcutta as the most recalcitrant, but also a continuously object of planning. Calcutta seems to continuously demand international attention to planners. And the 60s is when the Ford Foundation comes in. And Partho will, of course, know about this when there's a mega international project float by the Ford Foundation and the founding of CMPO, Calcutta Metropolitan Planning Organization. And the amount that the Ford Foundation invests in this third world city, very much like a houseman's palace, which is bursting with revolutionary potentials, a city which is really boiling turbulence. And the one way in which you control is by bringing the benefits of planning, transport, housing, all of that. Now, very little of it again, and there it's Indian planners who are entirely co-opted. So I'm saying that the Ford archives exist. Arindam Datta of MIT has written on this Calcutta of the 60s. Projects again that were huge, some which were implemented, many which remain in the planning archives. So I'm trying to think whether one could compare a real Calcutta as an object of planning in the 60s with this projected futuristic city that the writers think.
Thank you.
I shared with you the reference to Arindam's article.
I have noted it down. I'll definitely look that up. Thank you. Yeah, that would be such an interesting study to kind of. And this is fairly brief. This Calcutta 50 years hence, and it's very strange because again, it kind of comes out of a. I mean, the changes that take place are fairly serendipitous. They come out of a technological innovation rather than any planning decision, so to speak. So it's in a sense the ability to build higher and higher that takes Calcutta off the ground. But mean, I'll definitely look up Arindam Datta's work and see what dialogue we can have between these two archives. Um, in terms of the examples of Geddes and the stakeholders, I've really thought about this because, I mean, I think what Geddes is doing with the Bada Bazaar survey and the report is that, I mean, he's essentially, um, how should I put this? I mean, he doesn't really follow a method of his own in a certain sense to come up with a survey. So to come, I mean, he doesn't have a survey method to come up with information about the territory. What he is developing rather through that, I feel, is a method to critique the CIT, I mean, that kind of an approach, which of course there the question of stakeholders is very much present, because I mean that's one of the reasons why I found it productive to read the Bengal Chamber of Commerce papers at the School of Cultural Texts and Records with this, because the BCCI were one of the stakeholders of this, as well as there were the Marwari Business Association and several others who were actually getting to, I mean, who had a say in terms of how the local policing would be managed, in terms of how, I mean, how the local inhabitants can be moved around and so on. So, I mean, Geddes's work, I haven't really come across, in this context at least, I haven't come across any concrete example of where he's actually developing a methodology through which he can do these. I mean, he can first of all identify who the stakeholders are and then create a systematized approach towards getting a sense of what their wish might be in this matter. He does, I mean, there are places where he gets into kind of controversy because of this. This is one with Smriti Srinivas notes where Geddes had I mean, I think it's in Tiruchirappalli or somewhere, maybe Parthada will be able to remind me of this, but where Geddes's, I mean, where she says that Geddes's view sometimes positioned himself in opposition to subaltern groups who invoked the language of rights to secularize public spaces, as non-Brahmin groups could oppose Brahminical hegemony through measures that were proposed by municipal governments. So that always remained something that he was not kind of, I mean, I don't know about all the projects that he did, but the ones that I have at least looked at, I don't see any methodological rigor in that in Geddes. But that said, I think what is important about it is that he kind of, he's good at calling out the kind of nexus of power that is creating the mainstream narrative, so to speak. So that is something that he does efficiently and does quite perceptively, I should say. But no, I personally don't know if he actually develops that, although both, I mean, in his work and in the way that Robert Unwin kind of developed Geddes's ideas. Again, this is one of the books that I was referring to as being part of the CIT's CIT papers. Unwin definitely makes it a point to kind of, I mean, he recognizes the importance of identifying local participants, and he tries to develop a method based on Geddes to work towards that. But for me, I haven't found that in Geddes, and that is certainly one of the reasons why I think, I mean, one reason why it kind of remains, I think, to the CIT at least, it seemed like somewhat somewhat vague in certain matters, is that it doesn't identify, I mean, he says some general things. He says, for instance, that the Hindu is fond of you know, inherited property, and they feel a kind of affective connection to the land that they have inherited and so on and forth. But nowhere is there a methodological kind of approach to that. I at least have yet to come across that. So yeah, does that kind of answer your question? Or, I mean,
We have time for maybe one or two brief questions. It's going on for 5:50 by my watch. So if we have a couple more small brief questions, then go ahead, please. Unmute yourself or type in the chat box. I know Shukanna was here earlier. I think she has left. Sharbujit is here as well. Various people who post very interesting stuff about Calcutta history that follow.
I mean, I
Yes, Sharbujit, go
Yeah.
ahead.
I have one question. This is more from coming from ignorance. I mean, how I was I mean, from Shujan's talk, what I found, I mean, how did Geddes carry on his own surveys? I mean, what was I mean, did he take help from other individuals, or I mean, the CIT, they had a kind of proper organization, but oh, who did Geddes work for, or how did he come in? I mean, this is coming absolutely from ignorance. I mean, I have very little idea. I only knew that he was here, and I've heard from you that he had this debate with the CIT and how the CIT didn't accept his recommendations.
Geddes, I mean, of course, he had his own methods, and I mean, he had a. When I said that, like it's when I spoke of the methodology, I was referring mainly to his methodology of identifying the stakeholders specifically. I mean, he of course has his own method, which he kind of outlines in the Bada Bazaar scheme. But again, like I said, that's not the best index for understanding how he, what his method was, because there he was responding to a survey that had already been done. In most cases, Geddes, at least in India, apart from the Indore plan that he draws up, where there is, I mean, a fairly detailed kind of detailed and exhaustive sort of understanding of the political history, of the social history of the land, and so on. Many of the others that are kind of significant are where he's brought on as a consultant by usually by, I mean, by native rulers, or in private sort of capacities. I mean, he's so there. I mean, the methodology differs vastly in those and in the kind of plan that he draws up for Indore. But I mean, his position is, again, is, I mean, he is, wherever he's going, he does have a kind of preference for the walking survey, for interviews, and so on and forth. But I guess in India, again, one has to consider his method, or the way that he was able to use it here, keeping in mind that he was here for a very short duration, and he was actually scrapping together funds so that he could move around. So he was kind of getting partly funded here, partly funded there, and moving around. So I'm not sure whether from these we can safely draw conclusions about what the perfect Geddesian method would have been. So, or what his ideal method would be. But from the Indore work that he did in Indore, and from the plans that I haven't gone into those in detail, but from what I've read from secondary literature on Geddes, the work that he did in Israel, I mean, that's again very, I mean, his positioning is always within these complicated and problematic, often problematic power nexus. There he is very much, I mean, he does have a preference for the walking method, but it's mostly a sociological methodology that he's developing there. I mean, sociological, and I mean, I don't know, I don't remember if he calls it ethnographic at any point, but it certainly is ethnographic in spirit. So that, I mean, that's the closest I can get to identifying a proper method. What he does have is some of these ideas that keep coming back, ideas where he kind of tries to identify, I mean, not identify, but more like localize these somewhat seemingly vague ideas that he has, such as the genius loci or the social soul of a city. And based on that, he tries to connect it to the kind of spatial use that that he sees around him in that particular territory that he's surveying.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can I just add here, just to quickly to Shujan and WhatsApp, that Gettys did have assistants, I mean, all the time. I just wanted to tell you, there's a very famous photograph which is published, it's there in the Indore report, where he's actually sitting with an Indian assistant. So it's not as if he didn't have local people with whom he, in Bombay, his students would help him. You know, he was professor of sociology. And elsewhere, he would have, the Bada Bazaar report was commissioned by the Calcutta municipality. So I assume there would be people from the municipality who would be helping him. So,
in fact, that the point that you make about being professor of that was, I think, what was it, sociology and civics? Is that what he had called the department? I think he founded it as well, is it?
He was the first professor chair.
Right.
I don't know whether he founded it, but there was something on the thing, and he was made the first.
Thank you, Fatula.
We have a final question, comment here. If not, then I will bring the session to a close. Thank you, Sujan, for a wonderful discussion, a great presentation for me. Particularly, I learned a lot, and thank you to everybody for questions. I think Lakshmi has left, but thanks to her also for situating our archive within the sort of larger materials. And thank you all who attended on Facebook Live and here on Zoom. Please like our Facebook page, follow us on Twitter at CSSC Archive to receive updates about our events. You can also email us at jbmrc.office@gmail.com, and we can add you to our mailing list so you receive updates about our events. We will see you again in August. Thank you all.
Thank you so much to the JBMRC and to everyone. Lots to think about and new things that come out of it, hopefully, that can be carried forward in consultation with the archives at the JBMRC. So thank you very much for your thoughts and comments and questions.
Thank you all. Goodbye.